Ken Cook here, and thank you for tuning into what you know is another one of my episodes. Something we hear a lot from corporations who want to protect their commercial interests is the dose makes the poison. Chemical companies make that claim all the time. They say small amounts of a chemical are not harmful, and we are protected by the legal limits the government currently has in place. Well, our politicians and regulatory authorities by and large, toe that party line, and we as the general public sometimes take their word for it. Today, we have two people on the show who have authored two articles that stand up to these big business proclamations. First off, we have investigative reporter Sharon Lerner, whose recent article in The New Yorker follows a former career 3M scientist grappling with her knowledge of the PFAS forever chemical contamination of our water and our blood. Sharon also examines how a culture of conformity and office politics persuades corporate scientists to stay silent. Sharon refers to Professor Philippe Grandjean in her article, a toxicologist from Denmark who, through his extensive research, discovered the harmful effects of PFAS forever chemicals in the human body. So naturally, I had to have him join me in the second part of my episode. Let's jump in. My guest today, the incomparable investigative reporter, Sharon Lerner. Now, I have spent the better part of 25 plus years working on these PFAS forever chemicals. I like to think I stay up on the literature. I like to think I stay up on the public policy issues and certainly the media coverage. But Sharon is a reporter who never fails to really knock my socks off with some new set of discoveries, new angles on this story that I didn't see coming or didn't realize was out there. So Sharon has been working on the PFAS issue for 10 years, I think, in round numbers. She joined ProPublica in 2022, and she reports from there now. Recently published, which we'll be talking about, an article in ProPublica and simultaneously in The New Yorker, no less. Before that, she reported for an amazing publication that we are deeply supportive of, The Intercept. She really caught my attention for the first time with a whole series of stories, not just on these forever chemicals, but on deeper themes about chemical contamination and exposure and the failure of government to do the right thing, the tendency of companies to do the wrong thing, and the unfortunate consequence when those two forces collide, which is we all get poisoned. She's been honored by the Society of Environmental Journalists 10 times, no less, and by the Newswomen's Club of New York, which named her its Journalist of the Year in 2021. I don't know. You're my Journalist of the Year practically every year. So I think they've just missed a few years there. Sharon, thanks for taking some time. You know, I am a huge admirer of yours, and I have a lot I want to ask you about that I haven't had a chance to ask you about before because you're usually asking me the question.
Yeah, that's true.
But seriously, this latest article that you published in The New Yorker, it's titled How 3M Discovered, Then Concealed the Dangers of Forever Chemicals. And it opens to a chemist named Kris Hansen. Kris Hansen was a chemist at 3M Corporation, which was really at the core of the PFAS industry and still is for decades. The story you tell about her inside view that ended up, in effect, paralyzing her from speaking out. She knew more than almost anyone and didn't tell anyone. And that's not such an uncommon theme in the world of toxic chemicals and health. So Kris Hansen came across as a sympathetic but tragic character, how she experienced her treatment at 3M, what she came to realize and when, and how that made her feel. But you covered it masterfully and really brought a human dimension to this. Can you start there, Sharon?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on. It's fun to be the person who gets asked the questions for a change. This story sort of surprised me. As you mentioned, I've been writing about these chemicals for too long, though not as long as you've been thinking about them. I started writing about them in 2015, so relative newcomer. But this story, as you say, she reached out to me early 2022.
Hmm.
And at that time, I wasn't really looking to write any more about PFAS. I'd written lots and lots of stories, and at various
Like
points,
John McPhee in geology, right? It's
yeah,
like,
I at various points I've said, okay, that's it. And then they just keep coming. It's the forever story. Anyway, Kris reached out to me because I'd done reporting in this area. And she, a few months before she reached out to me, had left 3M. She, for almost 20 years, worked there in jobs that had nothing to do with PFAS. But in the late 1990s, she was very young. She was in her 20s. She was a chemist in the environmental lab, and she was asked to test some blood. And she'd been doing unrelated things up to that point, and her boss asked her to analyze some blood samples. And basically, the company had been monitoring the level of PFOS, which is a PFAS compound, in the blood of its workers. And it had been doing this in house for many years. Her boss told her compound doesn't hurt them, but it's in their blood because they work with it. And they sent it to an outside lab to see if they could, just handle the work and give their environmental lab kind of, more room to do other things. But that the outside lab, when they were doing this routine test, had used for comparison some supposedly clean blood from the general public and found that it had some sort of contaminant in it. And could she figure out what was going on? So she's like, sure, this is her field of expertise. She
yeah.
is someone who knows how to look at trace levels of chemicals, and she starts doing it. And basically, very long story short, she ends up finding that there is indeed PFOS in the blood of the general public, as well as in the blood of many animals that she tests. And she tells her boss after she's repeated the test multiple times, and her boss says, this changes everything. And he goes into his office, and shortly after that, he leaves the company. So she's kind of left on her own with this weird job of she's discovering that basically her employer's chemical is in the blood of everyone she tests, and she's becoming increasingly upset by the implications of this, and also at the same time questioned and sometimes ridiculed and belittled by her bosses, who were saying things like, your equipment is contaminated, your test tubes are contaminated, repeat the experiment, clean your lab, fly over here and try the same experiment on different machines, and basically suggesting that she's made a mistake. She ends up encountering quite a lot of hostility from her colleagues with the assumption that she's done something wrong and she's mistaken. The way she ends up sort of proving it to her colleagues is that she eventually finds blood that doesn't contain PFOS. There are two samples that she found. One was from rural China, and it was a historic blood sample, so it was taken years before. And then one was from so long ago that it was before the company had been making products that contain PFOS, things like Scotchgard. So when she has things that don't contain it, it makes it sort of much harder to dispute the fact that pretty much everything else does have it.
Yeah. She comes to these conclusions, as I recall from the story, in the late 1990s, something like that, early
Yeah,
2000s.
it's in the late 1990s.
We've had whistleblowers at both 3M and at DuPont come forward to us over the years. Sometimes they've gone on to speak out. Some have just confided in us and asked that we not tell anybody.
Well, I mean, a couple things there. One, I don't actually think of her as a whistleblower
Right.
because
Yeah.
she stated it for 19 years or so after all this happened. And she didn't really process what had happened in a way, because
Yeah.
part of what was going on is that her bosses had told her that it was not harmful. And so she accepted that explanation at face value. We know now that they knew back in the 70s that it was toxic. And of course, we know now from tons and tons of medical literature that it is extremely harmful to all sorts of bodily systems. causes all sorts of diseases, including cancer.
At very low levels.
Very low levels. But she didn't know that, and part of why I think she's a very interesting character. I mean, this is no Erin Brockovich. This is not,
Right.
"I see this is wrong," and, this is not the kind of stuff you see in Hollywood typically. This is someone who told people for years, her neighbors in Minnesota, as they sort of became aware that the water and land around there was contaminated. She said, it's not a big deal, it doesn't hurt people. And she kind of accepted this very flimsy explanation from her employer and then kind of shut out the rest, refused to look at this issue for many years after it. And it was really only after she saw an episode of the John Oliver show.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, about PFAS. A former professor sent her a link to the episode. And she watches it and she says, "Oh, no, 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 that's not right." Because he says it causes all these problems and it's really dangerous. And she says, "Oh, this is very inaccurate." She says this to her old professor, and her professor says, "What exactly is inaccurate?" And then she doesn't know how to respond. And so she finally, after many years of like forcibly, having blinders on, she takes a look at the medical literature and realizes how wrong she's been. And I think it was a very emotional
Yeah.
process, and I think
Yeah.
she feels, I think still, very bad,
Yeah.
about not
Yeah.
having grappled with this much earlier. So I did obviously, write that story that we just kind of unfurled right there, but there was sort of more that we discovered together and that I discovered on my own that she hadn't realized. And
Yeah.
she begins to wonder, like, who of the people I was working with had any idea what was going on.
Yeah.
She actually is the person who contributed a document that I had read long ago that someone named Richard Newmark, who worked at the company, had analyzed the company's fluorochemicals and determined that one of them, PFOS, was the one that matched a compound that independent scientists had found in the blood of the general public. This was in 1975. So there's a document that says a 3M scientist knew in 1975 that PFOS was in the blood of the
Yeah.
general public, but then it says lawyers told him not to admit it, right? And so it turns out that Kris Hansen, this person I was talking to, was the person who wrote those notes. So after she's on running around her office trying to figure out what's going on, doing all sorts of research, when she's doing her research, she realizes that there's a paper on the analysis of blood, the measurement of fluorochemicals in blood, that was published by 3M scientists in 1981. And she realizes that one of those scientists that's mentioned in the paper is actually still at the company. So she goes and meets with him, and he tells her, "Well, I don't know what the big deal is. You're right. You're absolutely right. I've known this for more than 20 years at that point." She's kind of, blown away by this. So when we're talking about this afterwards, we're wondering, like, well, who else knew?
Yeah.
The response she was getting from her colleagues and her superiors was, "What? What are you
Yeah.
talking about? Like, no, this can't possibly be, you're nuts," kind of a thing. So one of the things I did was go find her boss, her former boss, the person who had said this changes everything and, acted surprised, shocked when she said that PFOS was in the blood of the general public. And it turned out that he himself had known back in the 70s and he knew all along, but he had kind of set her up to find out.
Yeah. It is layer after layer. To step back from it, it's not just 3M where this happens. The
Yeah.
same kinds of patterns happen famously, and you've written a lot about it with DuPont and their primary forever chemical, PFOA, which was a manufacturing aid for producing Teflon. But the layers of secrecy, even within companies, the siloing of the information and the knowledge, it raises a question for me of, in the case where we don't have civil litigation, which is the main way trial lawyers pry it out, that none of this information went to the EPA, or hardly any of it.
Very little.
So it didn't follow the standard procedure. It's not like the system was working.
Right.
The power that these companies have just by controlling the information, having this, unique access to it. There was a paper, I bet you've read it a few years ago, that speculated on the issue. The title was, Is Pollution Value Maximizing? The
Mm,
DuPont Case. And it was an economist and a lawyer pairing up. That's shocking, horrifying, right? But no, these guys did a great job. And they basically concluded that it made all the sense in the world for DuPont to hide what it knew about these chemicals. They calculated that there was very little chance of being regulated, and it would made much more sense to keep selling it until the regulations finally gripped them. They felt that it made all the sense in the world to continue keeping it secret and hurting people because the trial bar was years and years away from discovering it or getting a settlement of any kind, like we've
right.
seen in recent years in Parkersburg and elsewhere, multi-million dollar settlements, including in Minnesota by the state itself. So it made sense from that standpoint. Reputational risk, they felt like, well, we'll take our lumps, but it won't be so bad. People will forget after a while. And so they conclude that the real issue across all these companies that we need to worry about is not so much a factor of environmental law per se, but the underlying protections that we provide to these companies to treat them as people, let them keep secrets, let
Yeah.
them control the information, no matter if it's information, tobacco, asbestos, firearms, plastic now, where they knowingly are causing harm.
Right.
Their own studies show it. They're smart to keep it secret. I mean, you've covered so many of these types of stories. I always wonder how these folks can write, a horrible memo, call it confidential, do not disclose, put it in their file drawer, and then drive out through the community that their own factory is poisoning. I don't know who does that, but people do it. But what do you think the structure of this secrecy is at the human level?
Well, it has to be worth your while, right? With this story, I was sort of framing it in my own head as like, why do people keep these secrets? This is the same question, right?
Yeah.
With Kris, why did she not speak out sooner? Well, she was working at her job, she wanted to
Yeah.
just like keep her job, and
Sure.
talking to her boss, Jim, he felt like he was trying to do what he could within the company. Of course, it took him, a good 20 years from, of working with it before he got tired of it all and quit and set up Kris to do the same thing. And then took her 20 years. So between, it's like 40
Yeah.
years. There is this one conversation that really stayed with me and it really sort of I found it so relatable and sad. And, he described himself as a loyal soldier for the company. I think he also thinks of himself as an ethical person, right? But, he said that, he was the go to man who was like there to help the bosses with problems when they had them. And some of that helping involved covering things up, no doubt. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
want to put words in his mouth. It's a man in his 80s, and he was telling me about this award that his bosses gave him, and what you got was you got to go away on this fancy weekend. He took his wife, and they went to, like, some very fancy hotel with all the bosses, and I'm sure they had very nice dinners, and I just thought about, like, how things like this are incredibly powerful in this
Yeah.
way. It's the esteem of your, colleagues and they gave him this award and many years later, he's thinking about this award and how important it made him feel, And I
Yeah.
think on some level, you want your bosses to pat you on the head, and in that world, he's getting patted on the head for covering up some big mistakes. Mistakes that
Yeah.
and I mean, the problem is, like, I make a big mistake, there can be serious consequences, but, like, if I mess up a story, I'll lose my job maybe, but the consequences will not be poisoning,
Yeah.
It's just like this is a world where, striving for the approval of your bosses can come at a really high price
Yeah.
for everyone.
And, as I was reading your New Yorker story, this is a topic you and I have at least touched on a few times. I found myself thinking, she was so wrapped up, it seemed like, in the 3M world. And of course, it was her livelihood as well. It seemed a lot like maybe the mechanism of regulatory capture in a government agency in some respects, right? Where you have some of the same forces pulling at you, the loyalty to the traditions of the agency. And sometimes that means approving chemicals or looking the other way or developing relationships with people who come in all the time because they're industry lobbyists and scientists and they're
Yeah.
paid to come in. They're sort of subject to the same dynamics. They want a job, they want a career, maybe they've gotten awards, maybe their boss is saying, our job is to get through this docket quickly. The critical element of individual decision making where you speak out against a system and say, I'm going to have to disagree here. I don't think I can go forward and do this. But it's rare
Yeah.
that that happens, right?
Right. And which is why I hope I don't want to be unfair to Kris here. We
No,
wouldn't be having this conversation if she hadn't come in and
she did come
contacted
forward.
me. She
Absolutely.
did. It took her time, but I do think most of us are like Jim and like Kris more than we are like Aaron Brockovich or,
Yeah.
there's a woman named Fardine Ollier. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she was a true whistleblower at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency.
Oh, yes, I have come across her.
Right.
I think we defended her at one point in the media.
She was doing research on what were then called PFCs, now PFASs, right? In Minnesota. And 3M had dumped the chemicals all around the state. And she was finding them in the water and she was finding them in the soil and she was documenting it. And the head of the state agency that she worked for was a former 3M executive and told her not to publish the report
Yeah.
she was working on. She went
Yeah.
ahead, she spoke to the media about it. She lost her job,
I
and this is what
remember.
happens to whistleblowers,
Yeah.
right? And she suffered greatly. I've interviewed her a number of times. She lost her home. She told me about like she never worked in science again. And it was really an incredible trauma and, a horrible experience for her. So I think that,
Yeah.
it's hard to ask that of people, right?
There's a tremendous overburden of pressure on people to make those kinds of decisions and step out of the system. And I left your article with nothing but admiration and sympathy for Kris. I thought she
Yeah.
was courageous to pick up the phone and reach out to you. Same with the Minnesota official you just mentioned. It is asking an awful lot, but then
Yeah.
there's a lot at stake as well.
Yeah.
As I've, followed your byline, followed your career, it relates to the notion of, well, if I'm working inside a company now and I see that there are so few places in the media where I'm likely to have my story told well and fully, not everybody gets a New Yorker story, let's face it.
Yeah.
Give us your sense of that dynamic. I keep telling my colleagues in the public interest community that we need to be talking a lot more about the impact the collapse of the journalism business model is having on civil society and public policy in
Yeah.
our area and in the environment. But what is your sense of that? Do you think that
Oh,
there's a dynamic there that's making it worse?
well, I mean, the consolidation of the media and the collapsing of so many publications, it's been heartbreaking in recent
Yes.
years to just see this contraction. It's like immense. There are so many journalists out of work, and it makes a huge difference, right? I just have been very lucky that I've been employed first at The Intercept and now at ProPublica. Very
Yeah.
lucky to be employed at these places that do value this kind of work. I mean, I think it's anywhere you slice it. It's for the public. We don't, there are so many stories that don't get told. That's the worst
Yeah.
part of it. I definitely feel so bad that I can't cover everything I'd like to cover and
Yeah.
everything that needs to be covered.
Yeah. Increasingly, even if you do get a story in an outlet, it tends to be much shorter than it would have maybe been before. And then
Yeah.
the readership is so diminished. And so the importance of your work is that this is really a crisis. It
I agree.
plays to the even greater advantage of the industry that, as
Yes.
we described, already has all the control
Yeah.
over the information, or too much of the control, all the information. We've talked about, briefly at least, about regulatory capture and why that should be a concern. Do you feel like things are getting better, not changing, getting worse? I feel like there's a growing gap between regulation and what we know in science, but kind of always been there. But do you think it's getting wider, or do you think we're closing the gap a little bit?
I wish I thought we were closing the gap. I don't. Obviously there is a sort of swinging of the pendulum that happens to some degree with the administrations, and certainly under Trump was covering a lot of really egregious stuff. But under the Biden administration, still a lot of regulatory capture issues, a lot of people who have been at the agency a long time that have very close ties to various industries. I mean, the Supreme Court it has shifted. We obviously that's a big factor as well.
Yeah.
But also, I'm seeing I think a somewhat emboldened chemical industry in some ways, like as the EPA is now in the midst of trying to regulate formaldehyde. You saw the American Chemistry Council sue. The
Yeah.
case got dismissed, but there's a sense of like, you make a false move and, we're, even if you don't make a false move, we're going to sue you. And they
Yeah.
have so much more money and the ability to essentially harass them into doing what they want them to do. So,
Or splitting the difference, which is also can also be very bad, right? I mean, that's
yeah, splitting the
yeah.
difference. Yes.
On the one hand, I appreciate that the agency takes its time on regulations like the PFAS limits they just set for
Mhm.
drinking water.
Yeah.
And some people were critical that they hadn't included more of the PFAS family. There are thousands of them, and only a handful have really been given a thorough look. Most
Yeah.
people think they're all going to be toxic at some level. We should try and regulate them as a class. The agency's lawyers have concluded so far that that can be risky, and they didn't make the rule vulnerable by going too far and being caught up in litigation by water utilities and chemical companies for decades.
They're going to get sued anyway. They're already
They're going
being
to get
sued.
sued. Yeah, they'll
Yeah.
always get sued, but will they lose? And how quickly will they lose? And with these
Mhm.
courts, anyway, I do have some sympathy for it, but I also appreciate that this is another part of the regulatory apparatus that mitigates against doing the right thing and doing it
Right.
quickly, doing it timely.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for your amazing reporting. I just marvel at how you find people whose voice, when you bring them to the page, illuminates something you'd never get out of a table of numbers or
Mhm.
a scientific journal article. You have a real knack for that, Sharon. It makes a huge difference. So thank you for being a great reporter.
Oh man, thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's all about people.
Sharon is right. It is all about people. And the next person I'll be speaking to was featured in Sharon's New Yorker article. Sharon writes, Philippe Grandjean, a physician who helped discover that PFAS harms the immune system, believes that anyone exposed to these chemicals, essentially everyone, may have an elevated risk of cancer. She continues, Grandjean, who served as an expert witness in the Minnesota Attorney General's case against 3M, has studied many environmental contaminants, including mercury. The impact of PFAS was so much more extreme, he said, that one of his colleagues initially thought it was the result of nuclear radiation. End quote. Now, in addition to accomplishments too numerous to name, Professor Grandjean has a comprehensive understanding of the history of toxicology. Our conversation today will be framed through one of his articles on this subject, and it calls to mind that old adage, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. Whenever we read news accounts that raise concerns about toxic chemicals in food, water, air, or consumer goods, we invariably hear in response that the dose makes the poison. It's the same phrase repeated again and again, mostly by those who, for whatever reason, want us not to worry about exposure to very small amounts of toxic pollutants or contaminants at the levels of parts per million, billion, or even parts per trillion. Of course, We often hear the dose makes the poison as a way of diminishing concerns about research EWG publishes on toxic chemicals in everyday life. And every time I hear it, I have a little episode. Those who say the dose makes the poison often claim it is the first rule of toxicology, whether it's a pesticide in food or the PFAS forever chemicals polluting our tap water, is at levels too low to cause harm or too low to worry about at all. Quite often, those who offer this first rule of toxicology have a vested interest in downplaying the impact of chemical exposures we experience in everyday life. We might take up any number of topics today with Professor Philippe Grandjean, our guest, across the hundreds of scientific papers he has published on the effects of toxic chemicals on our health. Professor Grandjean is a prominent Danish medical doctor and scientist working in the field of environmental medicine and health. He's the head of Environmental Medicine Research Unit at the University of Southern Denmark and adjunct professor of environmental health at the Harvard School of Public Health. He's made pioneering contributions to environmental health over his entire career. Today, we're focusing on a paper Professor Grandjean wrote in 2016 on a topic I think somewhat unusual for him because it deals with the history of science, specifically the history of toxicology and one particular toxicologist. Now, in a literal sense, the dose makes the poison is the first rule of toxicology. It was coined by a scientist who went by the name of Paracelsus. Here he is, dressed not for Halloween, but for the German Renaissance, the period in which he lived and worked. Born the year after Columbus discovered America, Paracelsus was a medical doctor, philosopher, chemist, alchemist, and author. Today, we're going to revisit this scientist, physician, Paracelsus, and examine how the science of toxicology has evolved and whether or not concerns about toxic chemicals in our lives can or should be dismissed because exposure levels are low and the dose makes the poison. Our guide will be Professor Philippe Grandjean, the author of this paper, Paracelsus Revisited: The Dose Concept in a Complex World. Professor Grandjean, thank you for joining us. Thank you for all you've done for environmental health, including this wonderful paper that you wrote in 2016. I wonder if you might begin by telling us a little bit about Paracelsus and his role and reputation in the science and medical circles of his time.
I'm happy to, and let me say, first of all, I'm very pleased to be with you in the EWG, because I often refer to the kind of work that you do that is parallel to what I do, and which is inspiring to me and to consumers and environmentally concerned citizens across the world. So I'm
Thank
very
you.
happy to to be part of this program. First of all, say about Paracelsus that he's really oftentimes misunderstood when people say, "Oh, it's a dose that makes a poison," and because everything is a low dose and therefore not a poison. That's not Paracelsus's teaching, because he started out saying, what is there that is not poison? And he expanded that view by saying even water can be poisonous. It's the dose that is important. But that
Yeah.
means that he's essentially saying before you can tell us that something is not a poison, you have to consider the dose. This is what many people who are protecting their commercial interests, or whatever it is, they would say,
Yeah.
hey, these doses are very low, but usually they don't know if the doses are low. I mean, think of the producers of PFAS. They said for years, our products are not toxic to human health or cause adverse effects in the environment. They said that for decades, assuming that the doses that ended up in our bodies were very low. And it turned out that they weren't, and that there are
Yeah.
toxic effects. So we have to sort of understand Paracelsus correctly, because he said, what is there that is not a poison? That's the opposite
Right.
thing of what the PFAS industry, for example, has said.
Yeah. I always mention to people, look, if the dose makes the poison, why doesn't everyone get lung cancer who smokes? If the dose makes the poison, why are only some, an alarming number, but not every child has asthma, but a growing number of them do. So there must be something going on besides just the dose. We're really just beginning to understand the complexities of dose in this complex world.
And this is where the concept of risk comes in, because it's not like the more we're exposed to toxic chemicals, the more diseases we will develop. Mm-mm. It's the risk, that is, the chance of being affected at some point. It may happen earlier or later. And it also depends on what else are we exposed to. Is it, let's say, tobacco smoke in regard to lung cancer? We need to do much more of, let's say, lateral thinking. So when we know something about one or two or a few forever chemicals, we need to consider them members of a family of chemicals, because otherwise we will never get to where we want to be, because there are thousands of potentially toxic chemicals. And Paracelsus would have said they're all toxic, but it depends on the
That's right.
dose. He didn't say, don't worry about the toxicity because it depends on the dose. No, he said that are toxic. Even table salt is toxic. In principle, it's a dose that determines it. That's a very important misunderstanding. And in my mind, it means that we should control much more of the dangerous chemistry instead of waiting to see if we can find a proof, a final answer, or this kind of thing. That'll never work.
Yeah. It'll take too long. Too much damage will be done. You brought up I guess, the concept of mixtures or different types of chemicals we're exposed to at the same time. But it's been really problematic to try and understand the implications of these mixtures in the service of trying to protect us from what might be the effects of maybe additive effects, multiple carcinogens. Is it appropriate or not to ever add them up? Is there a synergistic effect where two things coming together that maybe weren't as harmful independently, but when they're combined, the harm goes up? How do we struggle with the reality of our exposures now, Professor Grandjean? I mean, the reality is, we wrote recently about chlormequat. We found it in cereal in the U.S. We also found it in people's blood. It's widely used in Europe, and studies have already found it there everywhere, but it's fairly new to the US. In that same week, the news was about another weed killer that showed up in pregnant women. So they have this chlormequat in them, they have a weed killer in them, they have dozens of other substances while they're pregnant. How do we think about that, and the government's maybe even science's inability to get our arms around what that really means?
That's where I really envy you, because I know I am never going to be able to produce the scientific basis for a proper decision. That decision is going to have to be inspired by the EWG. And you have a very important role in, let's say, translating the bits and pieces of the science, and to say, we cannot wait many decades for the science to produce a few more pieces of for this jigsaw puzzle. We really need to move ahead here, because there's too much at stake. One of the major problems is that, let's say, you're worried about several pesticides that may be occurring. It could be food contamination, or it could be water contamination. What we can do is to measure the pesticides or the metabolites in a blood sample. Oftentimes it's a urine sample, but it's just a sample that has been taken at a particular time. And what really counts is not what's happening now. What really counts is what has happened to this person as a fetus and then onwards and up to today. Basically, we don't know. And so we may have single samples that'll tell us a little bit about the story. Statistically, that means that we will underestimate what's really going on simply because we really don't know the exact amount that has over time, let's say, reached the brain, reached the gonads or the liver. We simply don't know. We just have single samples that we have analyzed for the pesticides or metabolites that the laboratory can actually handle. We are really just dealing with the tip of the iceberg. I'm hoping that the little pieces of evidence that we can manage to produce and to make available for decision makers, I'm really hoping that that will inspire decisions to better protect the environment and public health.
Yes, and we completely agree. We have conducted risk assessments. We've worked in the regulatory process where they regulate one chemical at a time. So you can't introduce evidence about another neurotoxin, even if it affects the nervous system in the exact same way. When they come into the marketplace, they're treated as if it's only that chemical and only that exposure route that is relevant. So you start off, as I think you're emphasizing, you start off with a pitiably small amount of information, an amount of information that would have disappointed Paracelsus, I think, who was insistent on facts, not and nature, and not tradition. To me, it's often the practice of toxicology by industry and by regulators seems to be a practice of a science that allows more exposures rather than raises concerns about them. They're never added up. We're never looking across multiple chemicals. Is in the case with chlormequat. We learned about it. Our first response was chlorma what? It's it's a growth regulator, and now it's probably going to be widespread in Americans as a result of this new decision by EPA to allow it on grains. It was made during the Trump administration, probably no surprise. But this adding up of all of these exposures, we come away thinking, we're never going to have the scientific capacity to do enough studies of all the different combinations of chemicals. It's really impossible to do. We basically say to people, look, there's nothing wrong with avoiding exposures to chemicals even if they're legal, because they may not be safe. They may just be legal. Our audience might want to know just a little bit, if you would talk about it. When you first raised questions about mercury in fish and raised concerns that led EPA to at least begin reconsidering the amount of mercury that it allowed in fish that was caught, and then FDA deals with the fish that's bought, you found yourself facing some serious opposition, right? Where there was a strong, well-funded campaign to push back at the concerns you were raising. Can you say a little bit about that? Because I think sometimes people don't realize that there's a level of combat that people don't see, where scientists like you, I think of, may he rest in peace, Herb Needleman, who was also a dear friend and colleague who did pioneering work on lead, how he was attacked by the lead paint industry for his work. If you're comfortable talking a little bit about what you experienced.
What happened was that the tuna canners, they were very upset that somebody would cast doubt upon the usefulness of tuna as part of a nutritious human diet. And so one of the things they did was to buy whole page ads because the studies that we did included a population in the Faroe Islands where they actually happened to eat pilot whale, which is not an endangered species. And for hundreds of years before mercury pollution was discovered, they've been eating
Yeah.
pilot whale. So the campaign said it's not mercury that's toxic, it's whale meat. Please don't eat whale meat because mercury was not a hazard. You can imagine whole page ads could cost quite a bundle.
Yeah, sure.
They also had started a campaign, not just the tuna canners, that emphasized that science had to be sound. I can brag about my own experience that my work on mercury was not considered sound science. And like a colleague said to me at Harvard, you should take it as a compliment. So, because it really got the vested interests something to think about.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And the toxicologists that we've come to admire, and there are many of them out there, you're at the forefront. They're not afraid to raise concerns about chemicals that are linked to an important industry. I had a toxicologist who worked for me one time who said that when he was in graduate school, the only chemicals toxicologists were studying were the chemicals that had already been banned, right? And just doing more and more studies about that because it was safer to publish and so forth. But the truth of the matter is that the frontier, which I like to think Paracelsus would be on now, right? The frontier would not be dismissing low doses. It would be inquiring, well, what might those doses mean? Let's find some real evidence before we decide that a part per trillion isn't meaningful. Right now, the Environmental Protection Agency is considering a 4 part per trillion standard for various PFAS in drinking water, parts per trillion. And some of us have concerns that there might be still harm at the 4 ppt level, right? We really need to grapple with the reality of these exposures we're
Mhm.
facing, and much more research needs to be applied to that, and not just defending products to keep them on the market and keep adding more and more doses of toxic chemicals to our daily lives.
And we need to appreciate what's called the untested chemicals assumption, meaning that if we don't know anything about a chemical, it's assumed that it's non toxic. It should actually, I mean,
Yes.
taking Paracelsus as inspiration, it should be the other way around.
Don't assume anything like that until you really know. And in many cases, the industries have no vested interest in knowing and finding out. They'd rather push back and say, look, there's doubt here. Let us keep making the stuff and selling it. Toxicologists are saying, well, we'll just add that to your body burden, to the chemicals that are already in you, no matter what interactions might take place or what additivity across neurotoxins and carcinogens. Those are too hard to figure out. So we're going to allow it to continue. And it strikes me that from what I read in your paper, that's the kind of thing that I think Paracelsus, just speculating 500 years back, I think if he were brought to current time, I think he might say, that doesn't make sense as nature would suggest.
I think we need to move forward at a different pace than we have
Yeah.
lately. I think we need to continue pushing. I know it's risky because there are people out there who are part of the vested interests who try everything
Yes.
they can. They have law firms trying to get hold of my raw data. I can't give it to them because it's like people's private information that I rely on.
Yeah.
Or they write critiques and they insist that I stand in front of a judge and allow myself to be interrogated. They get hold of information where I express myself in slightly different ways. And then they say, oh, but Philippe, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's saying things in different ways. You can't rely on him.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is what's going on. So I think
Yeah.
we have a difficult challenge in front of us, but we should not give it up because the work
No.
that we are doing is so important, and in my mind, and I'm saying this again, for future generations.
Well, thank you so much. And we're not going to give up the work, not for 1 minute. We're doubling down. We're trying to even publish more in the scientific literature. You may have noticed coming out of EWG, we're trying to even raise our standard. But Professor Grandjean, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for your contributions to understanding how this mess we've made of our world with all these toxic chemicals that find their way into our bodies even before we're born, for trying to unravel that problem and lead us to solutions. I think people, if they have a concern about toxic chemicals and they've done a little reading and understood that it's controversial, I think if there's a way you can avoid the exposure, it probably makes sense. I imagine that's probably what Paracelsus would do. So thanks so much for joining today.
It's been a pleasure from my side, too.
Thank you, Sharon Lerner and Professor Philippe Grandjean, for coming on the show, and thank all of you out there for listening. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our show notes for additional links for a deeper dive into today's discussion. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, head on over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. If you liked this episode, send it to a friend who you think would like it too. Environmentalism is all about meeting people where they're at, and if you're listening to this, you probably know someone who might be interested in today's episode, but just doesn't know it yet. My ask is that you send it to that person or as many people as you see fit. Today's episode was produced by Beth Rowe and Mary Kelly. Our show's theme music is by Moby. And thanks again for listening.